Okay. Our next speaker is Richard Hoare. He's going to talk about 25 years of experience dealing with human-elephant conflict in Africa.
So, this is just done under the auspices of the specialist group. And what we've got here is, in many cases, a few problem animals surrounded by a sea of people these days. It used to be the other way around. And fortuitously, Michael has just referred to what we'll now call CBNRM. It's a familiar term around the world, community-based natural resource management, devolved management. And this is really the way that we're managing conflict in the smallholder agricultural sector, which I'm restricting myself to, the subsistence agriculture. So in common with many other species, as you'll hear other speakers in this conference, there are actually very few individual animals in a population. Most populations are problem animals, very few that are a problem. It's not all of them. And in our case, it's generally the larger bulls. And this has been verified by clever people doing DNA studies. And if we look at one of the things you've got to do from the outset is look at what is the perception versus actual. So the perception of subsistence agriculture is that the elephant is the biggest offender. Then there are a number of other dangerous species that cause a few problems. And then there's a number of other non-dangerous ones like primates, pigs, rodents, birds and insects. If you go out there and do the research, you'll find that actually, especially economically, those are causing massive amounts of economic damage particularly, and they're not the subject of much complaint. The dangerous species are perceived to be the government responsibility in most countries, and people do legitimately need help with them. So how do you find the difference? Obviously through research, and you'll find that economically those are the big five, as it were. So research is critical. Nobody listens to it. Politicians and policymakers seem to regard researchers as one of the lowest forms of life, and they do not really take notice of what we've been producing all these years. Perhaps it's our fault for not advertising it properly. But we feel amongst the lowest forms of life on the planet. So if you look at the mitigation categories that particularly smallholder farmers use, obviously research, I've just mentioned. These icons have traveled with me all around the world, and they're self-explanatory. So traditional scaring, disturbance, shooting by authorities, killing the animals, that's called problem animal control. Don't want to kill them, you put them in a vehicle and take them away. Various forms of barriers, various forms of olfactory deterrence, chilly methods. And then you'll notice the line, mitigation at the conflict site and beyond the conflict site. It's a very important distinction. So when you get into these more complicated things that need government policy, like CBNRM, where zonation and land use planning has to be part of it, and these dreaded compensation schemes and things like that, you realize that there's a lot of input that's required beyond the site level. If you take that whole slide and draw a line between the short-term measures and the longer-term ones, you'll see that those are very similar. If you take that same slide again and you put measures where we're trying to fight against animals versus those much more involving people, and you've heard already in this meeting how important it is to work on the people side of the equation, you'll see that it's the same thing. So what we were doing for many years was we went out there thinking, oh, we know all about these elephants, we'll sort them out. And we were working in the conflict zones, using short-term measures, and working against fighting against animals. And there was very limited success really at the long-term solution. So we're now looking more about working with people in the longer-term methodologies, especially in this CBNRM approach. Because as you will know yourselves, and you will have seen from attending other people's talks, that the psychology of human-wildlife conflicts is very similar across human cultures and animal taxa. And one of the reasons is that there's all these opportunity costs that have been mentioned by other people. You know, things like fear of moving around, especially at night, fear of kids going to school, people collecting water, crop guarding, time taken guarding crops, exposure to malaria, all these things. And I'm not a social scientist at all, but when many of you are, you will know from talking to these people who are being affected, these things are much more common than just quantifiable stuff like crop damage. And they're poorly quantifiable, and they represent a large proportion of the problem that we're dealing with in human-wildlife conflict, often not. So I'm just going to go through a few of these countermeasures. Killing has been used for decades. It's very cheap, easy and quick for authorities to kill an animal of any type. Free meat is dished out to the community. They love it. Retribution, but it's a waste of a very valuable resource, actually, and has no deterrent effect because of the individual behaviour issue that I told you right in the beginning. It's not a proportional relationship not a linear relationship between the extent or even the severity of human-elephant conflict and numbers of elephants and severity or distribution of the conflict. And so this has been the familiar scenario in Africa for decades, where animals are shot in crop fields, in a maize field, and people benefit directly. But when you test this idea of whether it has any deterrent on the other animals, it doesn't stand up. I acknowledge Loki Osborne for this data. We are working in the same place. Here's an elephant with a radio collar. Here's one standing right next to him. Shoot that one. What happens to the radio collared elephant? And he ran away for a bit, a few kilometers back into the park, hung around there for a couple of days, then started moving on the fourth day, noticed the direction of travel, crossed the boundary on the fourth night, and back raiding crops in this area 4 nights afterwards. So this is why killing problem animals of any sort is not the solution to conflict. So then in any discussion, compensation comes up. But in Africa it's been tried and abandoned in many forms and abandoned almost entirely. This is where you're going to do your speed reading. It doesn't do anything. It's an absolute disaster in our situation. I think in a few isolated conflicts with carnivores it has been shown to be applicable, but it does nothing to address the elephant problem. All the verification and expectation is never met. The opportunity costs, which I just mentioned, they can't be really put in there. Market values, bogus claims, corruption, so it's never fair. But even worse, all these last points, which I was very pleased to see John Kamanga mentioned a couple of them. There's no incentive to take responsibility. There's even perverse incentive to claim. Doesn't increase tolerance. Creates external ownership. I think that's what he was talking about, John, in the plenary. And when it starts to fail, it's impossible to exit by governments. They get trapped in it, and the collapse of it it affects the credibility of all mitigation efforts thereafter. So compensation has not worked at all with us. So you need something that can be a devolved system from the bottom up, and CBNRM amounts to a form of indirect compensation, really, and it's participatory, and it has to be linked to zonation and land planning. So these things require input from government and people that are outside the conflict zone. So it's much more complex than just going in there and dealing with animals. So I'm just going back to the conflict zone for a second, because with the chili olfactory deterrence, we have had some reasonable success. Package of measures that are easily put in place by the farmers themselves and communities. I haven't got time to go through all this, we can talk about it later. This is chili deployment. There are 3 methods: string fences, combustible biobricks that produce chili smoke, and a projectile method of delivering it right onto the animal, which you see here. Flimsy string fences around crops, fields, believe it or not, at the height of an elephant's face actually do work quite well. And there's an example of data from Tanzania where in 4 seasons, just using chili methods, HEC declined by a factor of about 7 or 8. But we have a new idea which has just been published, and this is hot off the press. The chili deployment was always around the target, obviously, around the fields. But if it's redeployed, elephants have a daytime refuge when they are habitual crop raiders, and they lurk in these thickets and refuge areas during the daytime and then come to raid crops in villages in the evening and during the night. And if you redeploy this chili on the strings in an area that they're not expecting it, which is between the refuge and the crop fields as they are approaching, it utilizes the behavioral aspects of risk-taking that animals don't really use logic, you know. They could come across a chili barrier, across a path, but they don't think, well, if I just go over there 10 meters, these are about 20-meter barriers across habitual paths that elephants use to go to their crop raiding sites. They don't think, well, if I just go to the end, I might be able to go around. They use experience. Most animals use experience, as most researchers and species experts will tell you. So when they encounter something, especially an olfactory deterrent that is sitting in somewhere that they didn't expect, they immediately get suspicious and don't want to proceed. And if the leader of the groups, if he pulls back, the others do as well. So it's proven that this simple technique is very effective, immediate. We call it a risk interface here, and we've taken the risk of calling it a soft virtual boundary. And those are the characteristics of it. It's entirely dependent on local knowledge, exceedingly cheap, and therefore this can be implemented by farmers themselves. And it's rapid results and very persistent. So we have the chance now of avoiding all these things that don't work, like electric fencing projects that don't get maintained by communities, translocations which translocate the problem as well as the animal, and compensation schemes, and then reducing wasteful destruction of problem elephants. This is where the trials were done in that period of time. Southeastern Africa, the green is the elephant range, and it was done in Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And we encourage anybody dealing with this to carry on, try it. Even in the forest range, it should be pretty effective, and anywhere else. And use things like camera traps, collars, and so on to do more intensive monitoring. That's the publication. When you make a claim like that, you've got to know you've got quite a lot of good argument behind it. So the principles of this, just to summarize, if you can just speed read this: individual behaviors, reduce the problem, don't eliminate it, you will never eliminate it. Work with people more than animals, perception and actual opportunity costs. This is one for the social scientists. Cost of human-wildlife conflict borne by individuals, whereas benefits from CBNRM accrue communally. Assessment of the problem, very important, scale, and this vertical integration, which I just want to end off with. What is vertical integration? We've got a situation where in government decisions are made in a hierarchical fashion. You just do what you're told, whereas in the conflict zone itself, it's much more consensual, and different people can have more consensual discussion and get their own solutions at a different sort of level to government. But it involves all this, and that's why it's exceedingly complex. I just want to show you what Sri Lanka has done in terms of governance, and that's what we're talking about. they've done this amazing thing where they've got mapped the whole country, where there's people in red, elephants in green, and both in the light color. And they've then quantified the conflict. And you can see obviously the relationship is more severe conflict in the area where there are both are together. And this is a very simple way that we could start off in Africa by mapping conflict and making better policy, because anybody can understand this. I believe it's a very good model to follow, but our Asian colleagues, I'm sure, can expand on this, whether it really does work. Finally, I'm actually a veterinarian as well as a researcher, and sometimes these things that I have to deal with have an element of poaching, utilizing conflict as a sort of pretext to go and poach ivory or assist communities who are supporting these illegal activities, bushmeat and ivory poaching. So coexistence is possible, often easier obviously in pastoral landscapes where there's more space and less intensive agriculture, but it is possible. It's not all doom and gloom. And as you can see here, that's not a Photoshop, it's an actual photograph. Elephants can be very forgiving. Thank you very much.